guys. Welcome to class 13 of environmental law. So today we're going to be talking about kind of wildlife protection and then going on to FIFRA, which is the statute about insecticides and stuff. Pesticides, we'll call them. The granddaddy of the wildlife protection statutes is the 1973 Act of the Endangered Species Act. Okay, so this is a little bit unusual from a lot of the other environmental statutes that we have explored because the Endangered Species Act is not, the federal agency responsible for it is not the EPA. It's the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. Okay, so fish and wildlife is land and freshwater fish, and then the marine environment is marine meaning ocean to river. That's the anadromous is the marine to river, like the brackish stuff. Say like a salmon can be in the ocean or in a river. It also includes incentives for states to create their own plans to conserve at-risk species in their own state that aren't necessarily an endangered species. The federal agencies can work with states to come out, to figure out who's going to administer some of these ESA responsibilities. It does provide for citizen suits, criminal penalties for knowingly violating the Endangered Species Act. Everybody likes to protect endangered species, right? But it is a political hot potato because the people who own land that they have to make accommodations for endangered species on their land, they resent it, that they have to, find alternate places for what they want, or they bought property and now they can't use the property. So it's been annually since 1992. It has to be annually renewed, which, if somebody says, oh, I voted against renewing the Endangered Species Act, that'd be, a villain. But anyway, there's a lot of kind of conflict about the Endangered Species Act and its application in practice. Okay, why do we have it, right? We want to protect species, partially because we have these ecosystems, right? And if we get rid of one part of that ecosystem, the rest might just implode. They're, circle of life, right? Everybody's dependent on each of the species. So if we have too many deer, that's bad because we got rid of the wolves, because the wolves died or whatever. So they try to maintain this biodiversity and have these interdependent organisms all survive. The ESA has been extremely effective. Species that were identified as endangered or threatened have prevented the extinction, and then were listed on the ESA lists. The efforts made to protect those species since their listing prevents extinction in 99% of those species. So whooping crane is an example, right? 48 birds before it was listed to now, 468 birds. That's a pretty big jump. And then it's so successful that some species are actually no longer endangered or threatened, and they've been taken off the list, like gray wolves, the agave bat, the bald eagle, which we'll talk about later on in the lecture. Let's see, this is just a list, a link you can check out on your own as well. See some alligators, falcons, grizzly bears, condors, right? I mean, it's pretty cool. that were, that absent the Endangered Species Act, some of those animals would actually be extinct, right? No longer living anywhere on Earth. Okay, so there's two kinds of listings on the Endangered Species Act. One would be the endangered, or the other is threatened. Okay, so endangered means it's in danger of extinction, meaning no more throughout either all or a big portion of its range, meaning it's kind of where it lives. Threatened, it species that are likely to become endangered. So, not quite at the end of the road, but, the way things are looking, they would be, the end of the road would be near. Um, and one of the things that is important under the Endangered Species Act is protecting the habitat for these endangered and or threatened species. I'm going to just call them like listed species because they would be the ones on the endangered on the list for the either endangered or threatened. So the critical habitat, right, the area that has to be preserved for this species to survive. Okay. And then we have our list, which is the endangered species list. There's also the threatened species list. But, the protections are pretty similar between endangered and threatened. Okay. So that's the first step. We have to, if somebody believes that a species is threatened or endangered, they have to apply for listing under the ESA. Okay. We have the Secretary of Commerce and the Secretary of Interior that are important here. So a citizen files for this listing. The secretary has 90 days to determine whether, this can move forward. And then they have a year to determine whether or not to put it on the list. And they have to use what we call the best scientific and commercial data available. And there is time for public comment. It should be warranted but precluded finding is that the listing is warranted, but for some there are reasons why it is not listed because there are higher priorities. Like, so there's a bug or something, but if we protect the bug, we're going to kill humans, right? So that would be a warranted but precluded finding by the secretary. It's pretty strict. Not a lot of animals, get on the list. Things that they look at to determine how high the threat is. Either the present or threatened destruction of this habitat, or overutilization of this area for other purposes. If there's disease or predator risk, there's no other regulations on this. And then, if there's anything else that would affect their survival. Okay, so we had that opportunity for comment. So one of three things happened. All right, it's either listed and that's published in the Federal Register, or it's withdrawn because there's looking at that scientific data, it doesn't support the listing, or we're looking at it again in 6 months. Once you are being considered and a species is being considered for the list, they call that a species of concern. And even if it doesn't end up being listed, these agencies might make some try to talk to the areas where these species are currently living, either municipalities, federal lands, or whatever, private landowners, to see if we can do something to help without the drastic step of putting them on the ESA list. Okay. So any federal agency, they have to put in programs to conserve endangered and threatened species. Okay, so if it's on their land, they have to put in programs to help them. Federal agencies also have to ensure that anything that they do are not likely to jeopardize the existence of the species or, wreck this critical habitat. Then this doesn't just apply to federal agencies. The taking of the species, any listed species, is prohibited. Okay, so that doesn't just mean like, oh, I'm going to go take that bald eagle out of a nest. It means you can't hunt it, trap it, harm it, or harass it. So, harass might be like, noise or development near it. So, you can't do anything to harm the habitat. So the term taking is pretty broad. It doesn't really mean just broad. There's more stuff to taking. You can, if there is a habitat conservation plan for the species, we might have something what we call an incidental take permit. So if there is like a habitat conservation plan and whatever you're doing to conserve this habitat might kind of result in a taking, you can get a permit. It's called an incidental take permit, and then whatever you're doing, it's binding between you and the agencies, the Fish and Wildlife or the other one, and it must either mitigate or minimize the impacts to the listed species. Harming, damage. Harming includes damage to the habitat, so it doesn't just mean touching the species, but if you are damaging the habitat at all, that constitutes a taking. If you have this critical habitat is somehow owned privately, there's things that the agency can do. They can buy that land to help the species, or they might purchase what we call a conservation easement, right? An easement is a grant of use or accessibility to land. So this is a voluntary agreement. Basically has restrictions on the use of the land that may or may harm the habitat or the species, or say the things you can't do. You can't develop the land in a certain way, but they still own the plant. They still own the property. So these they call these easements. They're more flexible options that the federal agencies will get into these agreements with private landowners. So this is in the early days of the Endangered Species Act. This was one of the first cases about it, 1978. So remember, it was enacted in 1973. So this was the decision. So it was probably pretty close. I don't know the exact dates, but I think this was like, right after it was enacted. So the TVA is the Tennessee Valley Authority, and they were going to dam up like a river, and to create a electrical plant, right? The standard thing, right? We're going to do a hydroelectric plant, and pretty soon after the enactment of the ESA, the snail darter, which is this little fish here, was listed as an endangered or threatened species, and this area was designated as a critical habitat of the snail darter. So, but at the time, this dam was almost complete, right? So I'm telling you, it's like right after the ESA was enacted, but the court actually held in favor of the ESA, saying like, you don't really have like options. You can't. You have to preserve the habitat, and the federal agencies can't do anything to harm it. And so the dam was never completed. Whatever. Upshot, they actually found like other places in the country where the snail darter, had plenty of critical habitats. But again, the dam was never completed. And then the Endangered Species Act was later actually amended to give more guidelines and more opportunities for things like consent agreements and construction easements and all of that stuff. Okay, so this is part of like these amendments. Under the ESA, Section 7, all federal agencies must conserve these listed species and have to consult with, Fish and Wildlife or the National Marine. I don't remember the acronym for that one, to ensure that their actions don't jeopardize these species or their habitat. Okay, so this is any management of land that is federal. So this is just for the federal agencies. Okay, management of federal land, plus some of these agencies manage lands, and in those management of the land, they might give permits and licenses for people to do things on that land: mining, fishing, camping, whatever. Okay, so the agencies have to contact the local Fish and Wildlife office before they do anything, and like, oh, do we have any protected species here? Get a list from them. If there's none present, then they're good to go. If there are protected species, they don't know what to do, right? So if it's not likely, they might have a may affect finding. And then you're like, well, more likely than not. If it's not likely, they can still proceed. If there's a determination that it would adversely affect the species, there's a formal consultation process. So you have 90 days from that date to submit what's called a biological opinion, or a biop. Okay, and the biological opinion, so that's kind of like a more in detailed, more in depth research into what's going to happen to these species. Okay, so if in the biological opinion they find no adverse impact, obviously the project may proceed. If maybe it's an incidental impact, the agency could impose conditions on what they want to do to protect the species. Maybe they do one of those incidental takes that we were talking about. If there is a 100% negative bio opinion, the project usually doesn't happen. And if the agency doesn't think the bio opinion it works, they can challenge that in court. And then we're just thinking back, right? We have this Endangered Species Act, but federal agencies are also subject to the NEPA, which requires them to look at the environmental impact of all major federal actions. And this is kind of another one of those amendments. There is a committee of high-ranking officials, like cabinet members, and they have the authority to grant an exemption to the endangered species list if whatever the government action is, there's no alternatives, if it's in the public interest, a balancing thing. So they call this Endangered Species Committee the God Squad. They're determining whether whether or not maybe they're not going to list something, or maybe they're going to allow taking or harming or something like that. So they are, the final arbiters over things. There is a general rule that no endangered or threatened species be placed into jeopardy by the actions of a federal agency. But yes, the God Squad can overrule this. There can also be an exemption if there are cases of national security, or the president himself or herself can make an exemption if there's a facility that was damaged after some sort of major disaster, hurricane, tornado, earthquake, whatever. They can make that decision to repair it and really not worry about threatened species, because these things have to be replaced after a disaster. Okay, so now we want to talk about private people's obligations under the Endangered Species Act. But before that, I want you to go into the supplemental materials and watch the video on Scream-A-Pillar, and then we will come back after that to talk about the private landowners' obligations under the ESA.